We're here at the Great Wall of Los Angeles with the young warriors from Tia Chuchas, about to be led by Ale Jimenez right here. Know your history, folks. Learn the true history, not the history they teach you in the books, because that's all written by white supremacists and people with their own agendas.
Ooh.
It's the real history. At least play pieces of it.
Pieces of it.
So this is the Great Wall of Los Angeles. This is one of the longest murals in the country, I think in the world, but it is a very, very long mural. It goes for about 2,754 feet. So that's half a mile, I think, I don't know. It's here in the San Fernando Valley, and I consider this to be one of the San Fernando Valley gems because it depicts the history from prehistoric times, prehistoric California, to all the way to 1980s. It ends during the Olympics. And the reason they even created this mural was to begin representing the history of minorities, the history of women, and the history that you just don't really read in the textbooks. So in 1974, this is when Judy Baca, she's the artist behind this mural, she began this over the course of 5 summers. And so we begin in prehistoric California, and that's 20,000 BC, and you can see depicted on the mural different types of animals that are native to California, and some of those animals are giant sloth, saber-toothed tiger, and mammoth. But it's very telling of what was here, what roamed here before any human contact, and especially before the Spaniards came. So La Brea tar pits. I think we've all heard of it if we've all been to LACMA, and it's still there today, which is crazy to think that is what held the fossils of these animals that used to roam here.
So when we look at this era, it's really important for us to acknowledge that before it was ever California, we had really beautiful, majestic animals that scientists have said have gone through history or have deceased because of climate change. But that climate change then was a little different, right? That climate change was like what we would consider like a very natural way of the way the earth had to let go of like the process of letting go of that life that once lived here. But when we look at the climate change that we have today, the way that we're going through our species is a very unnatural way in the way that we can look at the prehistoric time of La Brea tar pits. And one of my favorite things about acknowledging the wildlife at this time and era is that we have animals today that roam and live in our urban cities that are not really considered as like useful because we're so caught up in like expanding cities, creating more buildings. And so, for example, coyotes, they were roaming with a lot of the wildlife in this time, right? So they're like ancestors of that time that are still living with us in this moment. And not only that, but coyotes unfortunately get killed so often because of roadkill, right? We have mountain lions that are constantly being affected by the road and by urbanization. So it's a time period that I love to acknowledge, to know that this time period, when you look at it on like the large scale, it's literally like yesterday. It's literally the yesterday of the time that we're in. So that's not far long ago. And there's so many lessons we can take, especially like I mentioned climate change, right? And you look at our communities, we're the ones that are most affected. But that was like a time where the earth like let go of its animals very naturally. In terms of now, our climate change is being done by corporations, right? By big factories of pollution. So it's just a really time for us to acknowledge the difference and the time that we're in versus what our wildlife is currently at stake. So we have wildlife in LA, and La Brea tar pits is like a beautiful example to acknowledge how far we've gone in history and how so many animals of that time are roaming alongside us today, right? We have coyotes, I believe opossums too, the birds that we have. And so it's just like a beautiful time to acknowledge, like, we're not far away from that. That's literally the yesterday of our time. And when we look at dinosaurs.
So next to the water part where it has the wells and B&A shared about the well migration, you see a woman and vibrant colors and a big red circle, and
different aspects of the seasons and elements relating to Earth. Next to a person wearing shells and beads and an abalone necklace, which is like it's always been like a staple food and something that the Smuich people still use to this day, and as well as other California indigenous groups and along the coast. So with the red circle, it talks about the seasons, and you can see the wind, and you can see those vines growing, and it looks like the spring, and it looks like the spring enters the summer that goes to the fall, to the winter, to the rain and the snow, and there's also like a rainbow that goes through the middle, as well as like dolphins in the center. But that pattern behind the dolphins is like a pattern I've seen in Smuich like basketry before, and so like a part of like living in harmony with nature that like indigenous people practiced prior to colonization was using the plants and just life around to be able to harvest and create baskets and create houses, and with like a Smuich family, we like put together a tule mat, and tule is a weed that, and it's not a weed, tule is it's a reed that will grow from marshes, and is often used to build boats, because the Smuich people did a lot of canoeing, and the word Chumash has a translation to islander, but it also has Jewish roots relating to the lost tribes of Israel, and so the Chumash people, which I'm calling Smuich because that's what they call themselves prior to colonization, and the Smuich people would create these canoes pretty much out of tule, and they had existing relationships with islander and indigenous people, with the Maori, and there were cultural exchanges that were going on there before colonization, and so like there's the acorns right there next to the basket, and acorns were just like a staple food, and our staple food, and acorns we can make like I saw a recipe Julio showed me the other day for like acorn bread out of this one book made by the Chia Collective, which they're like California indigenous cooks and growers that are like regenerating their like traditional food practices, so stuff make with using chia and using acorns and other recipes that Julio and I will probably get to make sometime. Yeah, over there the Smuich man is like fishing in the ocean, so the Smuich people are ocean people, and so it's just they have like existing relationships with dolphins and whales, because that's where they're at, and marshes. It's pretty much that I could share right there.
Yeah, I just want to highlight too that when we look at this part of is that we can acknowledge that when you look at the basket that you can see on the mural too, is that the Chumash were known to have some of the most amazing basket skills. Their baskets can be found in many museums throughout the world because of the talent and skill that it took to create a basket. So not only that, but Chumash is also known as a native tribe that has existed for a very long time in California, and has been known that I think the longest human, or like the oldest human remain, can be found in the Chino Islands. That so it's like as far as they go, is that their existence has been here. They're still they're here still, and it's just to acknowledge that also they were really one thing that people don't really acknowledge about the Chumash is that they were also what we would consider like business people, right? They would be very good at trading. One thing that we can find along their crafts is what's that thing called? It's a
Spears?
spears, but it's made out of
Arrowhead?
arrowheads, but it's a specific material.
Obsidian?
Obsidian. Yeah, so we don't have obsidian in Southern California. You can't find that anywhere here. The Chumash were able to do it because they would go along Northern California, and that's where you can find it. Like near, I want to believe, like near like the Sierra Nevadas, Mono Lake. That's where you can find obsidian. So they were also really good at coexisting and trading, right? So when we think back to the Chumash, they weren't what we would consider as like savages, or they weren't civilized. They very much were, you know, they were able to cultivate with the land. So it's just something to acknowledge about how amazing they were with their baskets, that they're also really good at trading, and business people, considered business people now. Yeah, and one really interesting fact about, I know Tochli talked about their abalone shells. When we look back at how the Chumash saw the jewelry, it was very opposite to how we see it in a very Western capitalism system now. The Chumash would actually honor very small little holes on shells. Can't remember the name, but they're very small holes that you would make on shells. Believe it or not, it's really difficult to get a very small hole, or how they like the texture of it, how they did it, and that small little hole was seen as like prestige. You don't have to have so much heavy jewelry on you. They were like, that little small part of the hole in the shell was like basically, that's how we would see a really big jewel now, right? So they honored it very oppositely to how we look at very expensive, high, you know, whatever jewels and whatever rubies, I guess you can say. Yeah.
I think I'll share something too. So, like, I want to acknowledge the like beauty and resiliency of Chumash families that are like with us today and learning their traditional languages, and they're making that jewelry out of abalone, and revitalizing like ancestral recipes, and working with acorn, and doing creating this like basketry today out of the same materials from back then, and also defending their land rights and defending their existing ecosystems that they're connected to, because currently in the Los Padres Angeles forest, which is Los Padres, like, you know, but pretty much they have their trees at threat for logging, and this is something recently that became more of like a major threat that the Chumash and other like original peoples of the land where we're at now are currently working to fight against, and we need to be there in support and solidarity to protect these really old trees. These are like old trees. These are ancestor trees that have been around for hundreds of years. So the spirituality of the Chumash people has been like regenerated, and children are growing up with in like the traditional ways, practicing summer and winter solstice ceremonies, and it's a really beautiful thing to see and to know and to support. Smooch.
I know,
sorry.
I wanted to
Smooch.
say it, but I was like, too much, I can't.
I think this is a part of like our process, right?
Yeah.
Like seeking out to develop existing relationships with like original peoples, and then being okay with like being corrected by them,
Yeah.
and then being able to talk about them in the present day, you know, not like they went away. Smooch, like
Smooch.
SMUWI, and then the C has like an accent on top that's kind of like this.
And here we see it come to an end with a white hand grabbing. It has in its white hand an indigenous person, and this kind of just shows about how the whole world kind of just changed for them. You know, from one day to the next, everything was different, and nothing would be the same. And so, it kind of starts here in the Portola expedition of 1769. And the Portola expedition was an expedition that Gaspar de Portola was sent on along with Junipero Serra and a couple of other men. They brought along, this was their voyage onto conquering and establishing missions all throughout California. During this time, the way they were able to bring people here was through the Legend of Califa. And so that's what's depicted right after here in Legend of Califa. If you don't know what that is, basically there's a legend, like a lot of in history, the way they were able to bring people to the new world, to these new lands that they just had discovered, was through stories. Stories that weren't true, stories about this lost city made of gold, things that attracted them. Even Cortés even said himself, the Spaniards had a sickness that only gold can cure. And so this was a story they used to bring people. And so that's what the Legend of Califa is. They said that California was the land of black Amazonian women. And this was an island. To them, California was an island of only black Amazonian women. And so if you notice it here in the mural, they see this vision of those black Amazonian women through the smoke that's coming from a fire. But the fire is actually these very troubled indigenous people who they don't know what's going on. To them, they're scared, they're confused. Under the leadership of Gaspar de Portolo in 1767, the Jesuits were replaced with the Franciscan missionaries, and they were sent with Portola to explore and occupy. And so now we move on to Junipero Serra. So 5 missions were established on the Smuich territory, or the Smuich land. And even San Fernando Mission was called the House of Death. And so because they knew if they went there, they would die from the diseases that the Spaniards brought. Father Junipero Serra brought with him a number of Christianized natives from Baja California missions. So he used them as servants, he used them as interpreters and contacts with local natives. And so that is also who ends up becoming the founders of Los Angeles. So Los Angeles, the whole name of Los Angeles, which people don't really know or even realize, is the full name is Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles. And so that's the full name of Los Angeles. And another misconception is that Los Angeles was founded by Spaniards, but it wasn't. It was only among the people who came to Los Angeles, only 2 of them were Spaniard and the rest were mulatto, mestizo. We're going to segue into something entirely different, which I'm going to talk about las sistemas de castas, called the caste system. Have many of you have heard the term mulatto or mulata? Categorizations that they had created, the Spaniards, and this is like even dating before this. In Mexico, when Spanish were colonizing and conquering Mexico, they noticed that they were mixing a lot, and that there were more of them than there were of Spaniards. And so this is when they go and create and they commissioned a series of paintings. It was propaganda and is a way to discourage. It was a way to discourage Spaniards, but also to discourage Spaniards from mixing with people of darker shades than them. And so they had whole new categorizations. So if you were a Spaniard and you mixed with someone who was black, the baby would be a mulatto. If you were Spanish and you mixed with an indigenous person, you're a mestizo. But it was basically a hierarchy. And so at the top were the Spanish, and at the bottom were blacks and mulatto. And so this is how they created pretty much colorism, and which we still feed into in our communities, where they say, oh, don't mix with someone who's darker than you. Mejorando la raza, that's what they called it, yeah. In these paintings, if you were mixed with someone who was darker than you, for example, if it was a mestizo and a black person who were mixing, they would depict this painting where basically the woman was violent, or like darker people were just depicted as more violent.
I talk about?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think one thing to like acknowledge is that we constantly hear how we talk about that, America at one point was Mexico, and we make that like a very strong statement over that Mexicans were once here. And yes, that's very true. That's very important to acknowledge that people don't know, at least people that don't look into this kind of history, is that we were like Mexicans at some point did have part of this land, but it's also important to acknowledge that it was still indigenous land even when it was Mexico. And so indigenous people have always been here even before, it became Mexico. And it's just something to think about when we think of like the indigenous people and like the crossover with indigenous land or the folks that were here before. It's just something important to like recognize when we think about the Mexican rule in 1822.
In Texas, what basically happened was, so now this is moving into 1845. So in 1845, and years leading up to 1845, there was a lot of Anglos who were moving into Texas and setting up their own little colonies, but they were still in what was considered part of Mexican territory. And so they were in Mexico at this point, now that they had Texas, or they claimed to have Texas and California and all these states. And so now that they're here, the Anglos, they thought, I'm in Mexico and there are too many Mexicans here. And so that is basically when they started revolting and killing people and just making, doing all this mess in Texas. And Texas is very far from the capital of Mexico. And so it takes Santa Anna to basically, he signed off on his, he transferred his presidential duties to Miguel Barragan so that he could personally lead troops to put an end to the Texan revolt. However, just to mention again, it's a long distance and there are limited resources, so it took him quite a time. And finally, when he gets there, there are some losses, and so they even take Santa Anna and they capture him. And this is where it leads into him signing over. So there are a couple of treaties, and the timeline gets a little fuzzy here. But there was something called the Brown Resolution, which pretty much halted the fight between Texas and Mexico. But then there's also the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which we'll talk more about. Here in California, there was something known as the Treaty de Cahuenga. And I just want to highlight this treaty as well, because when we think about history that happened here in the U.S., we don't really realize that it happened in our backyards. And we talk about things that, happened over the seas, things that we're so far from, but it really just happened here. Like, who has ridden the metro before, right? When you ride on the metro and you get on North Hollywood Station and you sit down, and then the train starts going, the first stop it makes is now arriving to Universal City and Campo de Cahuenga. And so just right across the street is where they signed the Treaty of Cahuenga, which basically halted the fight between California and Mexico. But the thing about that is that there was never a fight, just to once again say that.
The next stop is Universal City, Studio City Station, at Lankership Boulevard and Campo de Cahuenga. Connect here.
So what ended the war was the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this is what seceded California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming. And so once again, this is after the Louisiana Purchase, and that was this pretty much tripled the size of the U.S. from what it was. So in 1848, in the same year that they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, suddenly, oh my God, out of nowhere there's gold, right? There's gold here in California, a place that we just got from Mexico, who they totally don't take it seriously, but this is now our land, and now there's gold, and now we want to bring people here. John Sutter, he owned a small sawmill, and James Wilson Marshall, he found flakes of gold in the American River. And so this sparked mass immigration to California about the same time that the treaty was signed. And so a lot of people came, and we'll go a little into Black history now. If you look at Mifflin W. Gibbs, Mary Ellen Pleasant, they're depicted here. They're very important. So in 1858, so one of those people who immigrated here to California was Mifflin Wister Gibbs. He was born in Pennsylvania. He moved to California during the gold rush. He was an American-Canadian lawyer, judge, diplomat, and banker. He was a black man and left California angered by this discrimination laws passed in 1858. And so, of course, now that this becomes part of the U.S., they start implementing their racist laws, which is why we see white only here in this part. A lot of those, I'll get into it. So in 1858, he and other black folks, they were angered when California state legislature passed discriminatory laws that intended to discourage black folks from entering or staying in California. They were deprived of the right to own property. They were disqualified from giving evidence against white people in court, and all black folks had to wear distinctive badges, which is a trip. You know, when you think about distinctive badges, you think about the Holocaust, and this is like way before that. They were just like trying to
Go off, sis. Go off. I hear you. I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
I'm shocked.
it's really angering. And so, and keep in mind, the first people to move to California were people of African descent. You know, they were the ones also here. And so now they're making laws where they can't own property. And so Mifflin W. Gibbs and two others went to British Columbia to meet Sir James Douglas to learn about the treatment of blacks in Canada. And so Douglas assured them that they would be treated like anyone else, and so from this point, him and several hundreds of black folks moved to Canada. Right off the bat, right? You know, there's discriminatory laws, and so he was important to history. But let me tell you about Mary Ellen Pleasant. When I was reading on her, I was like, damn, she's badass. So Mary Ellen Pleasant, she's a light-skinned black woman, and so some biographers claim that she was born a slave in Georgia, on a Georgia plantation. However, she claims to have been born a free woman in Philadelphia. There's a lot of mystery around her, and there's a lot of like people like who there's not like huge hard facts, but what is known is that she grew up as a domestic worker for a white family, and this white family were a family of abolitionists. And so she also learned to pick that up. She learned how to read and write, and so she naturally became an abolitionist herself. And so something she would do, she was a listener, right? You know, from serving these white families, she would listen. And so she knew a lot. She was a very smart woman. And so she married a man named James Smith. And he was a white man who could possibly be mixed. He was a merchant, and they worked together on the Underground Railroad as slave stealers. And so they helped slaves flee from their slaveholders by hiding them in their safe houses and transporting them to the North or Canada. And so, so James later died, and he left her an inheritance, right? He was a rich dude, and he left her an inheritance and to continue their abolitionist work. And then she married again in 1848 to a black man named John James Pleasant. And so this may have been her last husband because she did take his last name, Pleasant. But basically they continued the work that her and her previous husband had been doing. And so they continued to help slaves, but they were forced to move after rising suspicions of slaveholders. So for their own safety, they were having to leave Massachusetts. So they were doing a lot of this work in Massachusetts. And they moved to New Orleans, but then they settled in San Francisco. And so in 1852, they mainly went to San Francisco and California due to the gold rush. And so since she was new here, so coming to San Francisco and establishing a new life, she was a light-skinned black woman, so she passed off as white. I don't know how light-skinned, like there are like very few pictures, they're black and white, and so and she was a chef to wealthy businessmen, and so she would take advantage of this and basically being an invisible woman because she's a woman. she would eavesdrop on all these powerful businessmen, and these were some of the wealthiest men in San Francisco. And so she would eavesdrop, and she would pick up on investment tips. She would pick up on all the hot gossip on anyone in San Francisco. So she knew where to put her money. She was a smart woman. She became basically, she invested in real estate. She invested in real estate, opened up a restaurant of her own because people were starting to like want to pay her lots of money to be her personal chef, and she was like, I'm not gonna be anyone's personal chef. I'm opening up my own restaurant, and so she was earning a lot of money as a chef. And so with now the power she had, she was also continuing to help black people. And so she put black folks in positions that they had never gotten before. She was helping them financially, or she was like getting them jobs. And so in 1857, she left San Francisco to aid abolitionist John Brown. If you look into it, John Brown was one of those crazy dudes, crazy abolitionist white dudes who were basically fucking shit up, right? And so she liked this about him, and so she even supported him. She wrote him a letter saying like, I support you, I will fund you with money and artillery. And so they ended up catching him, and so he was caught and they hanged him, right? He was they pretty much lynched him on the spot, and on him they found a letter from her saying like, I support you, I'm gonna give you money, I'm gonna give you artillery. And they were like, they put it in the newspaper, they put it everywhere saying, we're looking for this person who aided James Brown, John Brown, James Brown, I'm sorry. And but the thing is, they're dumbasses, they read it wrong. Her name is Mary Ellen Pleasant, and the initials are MEP, but they read it as WEP. And so they were just randomly looking for anyone who had those initials. Obviously, they never found her, and she she revealed this later before dying. But anyways, there's a lot to say about her, honestly. Like at the end of the Civil War, in 1865, she went to the city directory and she changed her race categorization from white to black. So at this point, she finally outed herself, and she said, "I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." And so, very strong woman. And so she continued to speak out against racism for most of her life, and she spoke out after her and two friends, they were forced off a streetcar because they were black, and so she sued two companies. And one of them was like, all right, we'll let black folks on the streetcars, but the other company was like, no, we're gonna fight it. And they tried standing tall, but she stood even taller. She took him to the Supreme Court, and basically she paved the way for the desegregation of black folks in streetcars in San Francisco. So a lot of people call her the mother of civil rights in California. Just to bring it back again to the gold rush, because they passed very discriminatory laws in what used to be Mexico, used to be indigenous people's land. There was a lot of people, and especially when they brought the mission system, a lot of them had to adopt these names, right? And so they passed a law here in California saying that nobody of Spanish surname could mine for gold. And so they did that very quickly, and now everybody who already lived here couldn't mine for gold. And like once again, the U.S. showing that they only like one type of immigration, and that is from white people. Because now they're discouraging black people from coming to California and immigrating, but they're also discouraging people who already lived here and who probably like lived near, and like now they couldn't mine for gold. This part that the mural depicts, right above Biddy Mason in church, we have 3 people being lynched, and the first person you can see is a brown man. He's depicted with a sombrero, so I'm assuming this is a Mexican man being lynched. In the middle is a Chinese man being lynched, and then the third is a black man being lynched. And so this goes to show, like, again, who they hated in this country, and like who also built this country. Because we'll get more into it later, but basically, let me just pause it real quick and bring it back to Joaquin Murrieta. And so, okay, Joaquin Murrieta. Okay, who knows Joaquin Murrieta?
Oh, yeah, I've heard the name before.
So, I'm getting a no from most everybody. Yeah. But, okay, how many of you know Zorro,
Oh, yeah.
Everyone knows Zorro, right? So, he's actually, they take the inspiration, like all of his backstory, who he is as a character, they took from Joaquin Murrieta. Joaquin Murrieta was a Mexican man. He was from Sinaloa, I think. No, he was from Sonora. I'm sorry. He was from Sonora, and he came to California to mine for gold. He came with his wife and his brother-in-law. I think it was his brother or his brother-in-law. I know that both of them were a huge part in his life. But basically, this is where it gets really sad, and just to trigger warning everybody. His life is pretty sad, or what happened to him was pretty brutal. So basically, again, this was the land of people who knew the land. They knew how to mine for gold, and now they have white people coming in wanting to mine for gold too, and they're not gonna have much success. They don't know the land like everybody else here who was already here know it, and so they would basically follow a lot of brown people, or a lot of brown people, Mexicans who knew the land. They would follow them, and once they would see that they found gold, they would take the gold from them. And these were California troopers who were doing this, because now there were laws that prevented them from mining the gold, so they couldn't say anything about it. And so that's what happened to Joaquin Murrieta. He would be followed along with his wife and brother-in-law, and they would take their gold. And at one point, this is where it gets a little fuzzy too. There are different sources, different people say different things. The way I learned it and the way I understand it is Joaquin Murrieta. They accused him of stealing their gold, right? The California troopers. And what they did was they tied him to a horse, and they just rode off, and they left him for dead, and they gang raped his wife. And so they pretty much. They hurt her so badly that she fell into a vegetative state, and now she was brain dead. And so that pretty much crushed him, and they lynched his brother too. And so they left him for dead, lynched his brother, and raped his wife. And from this, obviously, was born hatred, was born vengeance. He was out for vengeance. And so one by one, he took down every California trooper that had a hand in killing his wife and brother. He went and killed them all, one by one. And he pillaged Anglo areas, and this is basically, now the U.S. had heard of him. Now that the U.S. were we gotta stop this man. And so they put out a bounty, I think about $6,000 for the head of Joaquin Murrieta. But nobody knew what he looked like. So they were just lynching any Mexican they saw, because if you were a Mexican man, they were you are Joaquin Murrieta. And so this is basically what happened. And in California, they don't talk about it, but they lynched Mexicans here, and they lynched them in Texas and just everywhere here.
I have a story about that.
Yeah.
I remember my sophomore year at CSUN, I was taking Chicano studies, and it was in September. I remember this. I'll never forget this, yo. So every Monday I had Chicano studies. Friday night, I had a friend over here in El Monte who was throwing a birthday party or something. And I remember me and my friends went, whatever, and at the end of the party, it was over, and we were actually leaving. Then some of my friends were about to, we came back, and they were about to get into a fight or something with these people there. And I remember, we're there, we're trying to, calm it down, trying to settle the situation, whatever. And I remember these fools, as they were leaving, a few of them were I guess they're repping their set. They were this is El Monte boys, homie, get out of here, blah, blah, blah. That was Friday night, yo. And I'll never forget this. They're oh yeah, we're El Monte boys. That was Friday night. Monday morning, yo, I come into Chicano studies class. The first thing on the little whiteboard, whatever, El Monte boys. Originally started as a bunch of as the Texas Rangers, something like that. A bunch of white people from Texas who came to California to lynch Mexicans, you feel me? And everybody there was Latino, you feel me? So it was damn, that's how deep the history goes, you know what I mean? How much it's how much we don't know about it. I wish I would have been the week before, I'd been man, y'all don't even know what you're representing right now. But yeah, I'll never forget that, dude. I was damn, that's why we need to this is why Chicano studies and ethnic studies needs to be K through 12, period.
That's all, period.
Joaquin Murrieta turned himself in, but he wanted the bounty to go to, he told a kid, a small kid, and then presumably in Spanish, hey, tell him I'm here, diles que estoy aquí. And so he turned himself in, and so they didn't even give the money to the little kid who turned him in, and they kept the money for themselves, allegedly what happened. But that's basically who Joaquin Murrieta was, and who we're pretty much what we all know Zorro, but we don't know who Joaquin Murrieta is. Okay, let's try to go to the next shaded spot. The Central Pacific Railroad Company recruited thousands of Chinese men to work on the railroad. And so that was a great influx of Chinese laborers and a soar of American unemployment after the Civil War in 1865. It furthered the discrimination against Chinese. And so this plus the killings of local ranchers, it led to the Chinese massacre of 1871. So another piece of hidden history or history not talked about is Chinatown. So Union Station actually used to be Chinatown, and that was where Chinese immigrants lived until basically, hold on, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the Chinese massacre of 1871, 500 white men stormed into Los Angeles, Chinatown, to murder and pillage Calle de los Negros, also known as N-word Alley. There were 19 confirmed deaths, and their bodies were hung in 3 different locations in Los Angeles, but nobody went to jail.
I said it seems about 2020 to me.
Yeah, since about 2020, the struggle for the Chinese continued for decades with the establishment of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers, denying their right to become naturalized citizens, and they displaced a lot of Chinese to make way for Union Station. So where Union Station is right now is where Chinatown used to be. And they rebuilt Chinatown, but then due to arson, Chinese massacre 1871, and then a series of arson acts in 1886, and then finally in 1949 is when they built Chinatown where it is now. Woo!
There was a red bus that just passed over there.
Ah.
Oh, there's a bus over there. It's over.
Okay, I'll start it off like this. How many of y'all have seen Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Yeah? Y'all like that movie, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? No? Okay, it's a bit of it's an older one, but like I think we all remember it as we were children. But I don't know if, I know I didn't realize it when I watched it, but that movie is actually, is it coming this way?
No, it's going over
Yeah, it
there.
is.
Go ahead.
Roger Rabbit is basically about the red car and about it was basically about how they dismantled the red car, and it in the early years it was an energy efficient for transportation. It had a vast network of electric railways. Like if you've been to San Francisco and you get on their buses and like their light rails and their electric railway streetcars, you think this is the best. You know, this is the best like public transportation you can get. Like I can get to anywhere I want, and I just need to get on this one train. And that's how it used to be here in LA. It used to be like people dream about what the red car used to be. People dream of those days, and they're actually putting it back. Like if you notice on Van Nuys Boulevard, you see how wide those streets are. That is because an electric railway used to pass right down that whole street, and it used to take you from here in the San Fernando Valley all the way to Venice Beach or to San Gabriel Valley. Anywhere you could think of, it would take you there. So a vast network of electric railway lines operated by the Pacific Electric Railway. It blanketed Los Angeles area with more than 1,000 miles of rail line. It went out into the San Gabriel Valley, San Fernando Valley, and it went all the way to Venice. So the Pacific Electric Railroad was efficient and got people to where it needed to go. However, when you think about it being a public service, that's not what it was really intended for. Basically, real estate investors were the ones who were putting up these railways here because they wanted to sell the land around it, and so they needed people to get to wherever they wanted to be able to sell that land. And so once they've sold that land, one of the early fools who did this, Moses Sherman and Eli Clark, in 1894. So they were real estate investors, and they bought up a lot of the railways, like the horse car, cable cars systems, and they formed the LA Consolidated Electric Railway. So they were already existing, but they like bought a bunch of them, and then they merged them together.
I think Huntington was the one who started it off too.
Yeah. They sold it to investors in 1898 to Collis Huntington and Henry Huntington. And so Henry Huntington is Collis Huntington's nephew. But this is again what they started to do too, which is they started to buy up all the railways. They're like mine, right? They took it all and they merged them together. And so Henry Huntington, though, he owned a lot of land. He owned a lot of land in San Gabriel, South Pasadena, San Marino. He had his toes in everything, right? In Redondo Beach, all these places, Huntington Beach. And then he sold the Pacific Electric in 1911. So this is called the big merger of 1911 because this is when like he sold most of his like ownership of the streetcars. And then he sold it to the Great Merger of 1911, and he sold it to Harry Chandler. So let me tell you about Harry Chandler. We even have a street named after him. And so Harry Chandler, like if we're gonna blame anyone for dismantling the red car, we should blame, or I mean there's a lot of people to blame, but I would say he's got the biggest hand in it. And so Harry Chandler, he was the publisher of LA Times from 1917 to 1944. And so he had his hands dipped in everything. He had it in the oil companies. He had it in the freeway constructions. He had his money in Goodyear, and he basically everything that is pretty much pro for like automobiles. He had his hands in it, and so which is why he started to publish a lot of anti-red car sentiments on the LA Times. And so this is basically where the negative opinions for the red car come into play, because now he was calling them slums on wheels. And so this is why people stopped voting for its upkeep. And so they stopped voting for its upkeep. And so after years, it started to get really run down. And not only that, they were starting to mass produce automobiles, which is why we have a car pictured right over there, because it's part of like what made America and what made California what it is today, because of the automobile. But at a price, I might add. So he started to finance roads, and people started to buy more cars, and they neglected the red car. And so the last red car was rode in 1961 from LA to Long Beach. And I think that's basically where it started to go downhill, because now that there's negative opinions for the red car, and now that the fat cat got even fatter, they only cared about cars. And I don't even know, I could get sidetracked on this for all day, and I want to kind of try to keep it more here. But I think if you go back into the Roger Rabbit, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, what's the guy's name? He played the Doc in Back to the Future.
In the movie? His name in the movie?
Yeah. No, like his name in general.
Oh, I forgot.
Well, that fool, he's a great character for it, because he was just like the character in the movie was like, no one's gonna ride these freeways when they can ride the red car for a nickel. And then the guy's like, they will once I've bought all of them, because like, you see, I bought the red car and I'm gonna dismantle it. Like, it was this huge evil plot, which it was, because I can tell you how many ways the freeways are racist, and like just so much, like, we have to have another discussion on freeways.
That's true.
And just show like just how this kind of, because the cars are not the future. Cars are not the way we're gonna go. It's public transportation, and they're even putting back where the orange line runs now. That is where the railway used to go, and so they took out the railway to put in buses. and now they put buses where the railway used to be. And now, like 30 years from now, they have plans to put the railway back. And the same thing was running down Van Nuys Boulevard. You know, they're trying to put all these back because they know that, you know, just how bad cars are for the environment, and just like how, sorry guys, there's so much in me that I can't get out. Growing, like the city, how the city was just growing, and how, I think that's the camera right there. But yeah, it was a changing scene. And so San Pedro, it shows the reason for it's called LA Monster Show is just because you could get short, it's because you could get to San Pedro. And there was a lot of flying fishes. I don't know what flying fishes are, but there was a lot of them. And to end it off, it just shows all these people and the flags, and just how much from the beginning when we were way back there to where it ends off here in like 1917, 1920s. Basically, there was a mass, it just brought so many immigrants here, you know? Like everything that happened and here was like a bunch of immigration, and the people who were coming here, and just who would make up LA, you know, later in time. And so that it ends in World War I, and so we consider that for another day.